All right, back to the difficult topic tonight that we're going to start with, suicide. It is the 10th leading cause of death in the United States, claiming about 45,000 lives every year. That means in the time it takes us to report out this segment tonight, someone, somewhere, will have taken their own life. We're going to be seeking answers. What can be done to stop this? Why is it happening? What do we need to know to save a friend's life? There are some facts we need to know, first of all. For example, men are 3 times more likely to kill themselves than a woman. White males in particular, 7 of 10 suicides in 2016 were committed by white men. And people are more likely to attempt suicide when they're in middle age. So that's what we know. Now the question, why? Let's start with this.
When you're in that place and your perception is collapsing like that, those old thoughts kept coming back again. You're not good enough. You're not smart enough. You're not enough. So I walked up and I approached the railing to the overpass. I walked along it. I looked over. I came to a light post on my left-hand side and I stopped. Should I hang in there for just one more day?
Discomfort, humor, relatability often run hand in hand when we talk about the big scary S word, suicide.
Suicide has an enormous cost to our society. The Center for Disease Control estimates that on average, a suicide costs about $1 million. And that totals $34 billion in medical costs and lost work productivity. Most tragic of all, 6 to 32 surviving family members, friends, and colleagues who will suffer and grieve their loss.
Suicide is in the news seemingly every week, locally, internationally, but we tend to experience these stories sometimes in terms of celebrity. Take Tim Bergling, for example. He's probably better known as his DJ name, which we all knew him by, Avicii. But he was a son and family member, just 28 years old, at the peak of his success, but secretly his family now says he was struggling with thoughts about meaning and life and basic happiness. They say he, quote, wanted to find peace. And that's what you hear so often in these cases. Several reports this week say Avicii killed himself with a broken glass bottle. A tragic, sad, unnecessary end to a life of an influential artist. But whether you're living in Missouri or in Milan, this does not discriminate. The best thing we can do, though, we're finding out, is reduce harm when talking about this, reduce stigma. You have to actually discuss it. So if you or someone you know has feelings of desperation or suicidal ideation tonight, there is help. Better days are definitely ahead. It gets much better when you talk to someone. So before we continue tonight, we're going to give you a phone number several times throughout the segment. It's the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. It's 1-800-273-8255, or TALK. To give you an idea of scale here and resources, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline operates more than 160 crisis centers all across the United States. That's how many people they need for this resource every year. I mentioned a moment ago there are 45,000 suicides every year in the U.S. Here are some facts to be aware of. Once we hit the age of 18, at some point in our lives as adults, depression is going to affect at least 1 in 4 of us. Yet only half who experience major depression actually get treatment. What's important to know, between 80 and 90% of the people who do seek treatment for depression are treated successfully. Sometimes that's through therapy, oftentimes medication, many times both. There are some important trends to be aware of and statistics that you should definitely know about.
It's a grim fact. Suicide is a major issue in the United States, where someone takes their own life every 12.3 minutes. Children, mothers, fathers, grandparents. First, the numbers for context, then the contributing factors. Suicide was the 10th leading cause of death in 2016, the most recent year of stats on record, and it's been a leading cause for years. But that doesn't tell the whole story. Suicide was the 2nd leading cause of death in 2016 among people 10 to 34 years old, and the 4th among 35 to 54-year-olds. For some perspective, there were more than twice as many suicides, about 45,000, as there were homicides, 19,000. The most common method for suicide is firearms at 51%. Next, suffocation, including hanging, at about 26%. Then poisoning and other. Men are more likely to use firearms, women often turn to poisoning.
If the black dog of depression makes you feel like the saddest soul on earth, you're not alone.
There's no easy answer as to why people choose death by suicide, but there are some clues out there. An increase among middle-aged people from 2005 to 2010 may have been in response to the economic recession. That's what a 2015 medical study found. Also, young people in rural areas are more likely to end their own lives than those in urban regions. There's even a pattern of more suicides taking place in the springtime. And for some young people, entertainment might create a link, or at least an interest. A study published in the journal Internal Medicine found that since 2017, the release of the Netflix series 13 Reasons Why, based on a teen girl who kills herself, suicide queries about prevention and methods increased online by 19%. The problem here is multidimensional, as are the people who carry out or consider suicide. Often, maybe most of the time, the cause is unique to whatever darkness is driving despair. 90% of those who kill themselves had a diagnosable psychiatric disorder, be it depression or anxiety or PTSD. One thing that we know can be done is this: if you believe someone's in crisis, talk to them. Experts say it's important to be direct, asking questions like, do you want to hurt yourself? And if you feel helpless, call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. The number is 1-800-273-TALK.
In a second tonight, we're talking about all this with a counselor. She's hearing from her own patients. I wanted to know, what is she hearing? And also approaches to help people we love, or sometimes ourselves. But first, to get a better handle on the scale of suicides across America and disparities among certain communities, I spoke with Idris Kaloum. He writes for The Economist, and he brought us all the data. Idris, so many of us imagine that suicide rates have gone down because we talk about mental health so much and wellness here in the U.S. But in fact, your article in The Economist, it blew my mind when I saw it. It says, in almost every demographic category, men and women, young Asians and elderly whites, city dwellers, rural folk, the problem is getting worse.
Right.
Although some groups are worse off than others.
Absolutely. You see a big increase for middle-aged men. This is along the thesis of deaths of despair, which Ann Case and Angus Deaton have written about. So it's things like, opioid addiction and alcoholism, an increase in loneliness, which we think might be causing a worse issue for middle-aged men. But across the board, you've seen increases, and this has continued from 2003 up till today, and it's basically gone at a constant rate, and we don't know why.
Well, and that's the thing. I see this and I think, oh, of course, the economy's been so bad, but no, it's been a steady line even before.
Yeah, it increased up until the recession, and it kept on increasing, and it's where we are today. And if you look at the other countries in the OECD, so these are rich countries, all of them have seen declines, with the exception of the United States, Greece, and South Korea. So the United States is actually quite exceptional in this set of countries.
People think, okay, it's a growing population. There's tumult. There's just problems here and around the world. So everyone's probably experiencing this. No, they're experiencing the opposite in most rich countries.
It's hard to know what exactly is driving this increase in suicide rate in America. There are a couple of theses that people have come up with. One is that even though the general economic health of the country is going up, maybe that there are bigger populations of people who are not doing so well. And so that's driving that. Maybe this is along the lines of Robert Putnam's theory of bowling alone, that people just have fewer social interactions and so are feeling more depressed. But we really don't have good ideas. Another theory is that social media is kind of causing this, but we don't know. And it's quite hard to distinguish what exactly is driving this.
The rural-urban divide, can we talk about that?
Yeah, that's quite surprising. So in rural bits of America, the suicide rate can be 4 or 5 times higher than it is in cities. Across all countries, men are about 4 times as likely to commit suicide as women. In America, men are much more likely to use guns, which tend to be deadlier. And in rural areas, we know that access to guns is much higher. And so generally across all suicides in America, for every death, there are about 30 attempts.
Someone is developing an algorithm, right, to try to spot a problem before it develops?
Yeah, it's an interesting theory that a professor at Harvard named Matthew Knock has looked into, which is training an algorithm to look at medical records and try and predict which people are most at risk. The issue here is that while we know depression is a correlate of suicide, there are millions of people in America who are depressed, but relatively few of them will actually commit suicide. So there are going to be lots and lots of false positives. So it's unclear how much additional help these kinds of algorithms can give. What we do know is that the signs of suicide are there, and if you notice someone who is exhibiting those signs, the best thing for you to do is to try and call and get help for them.
There are some other groups of Americans at risk for suicide that you may not have considered. For instance, LGBT youth, 5 times more likely, experts say, to attempt suicide. Also, new moms. They've just welcomed a new life into the world, and then some tried to take their own life. The Huffington Post recently wrote this, quote, "While postpartum suicide is rare compared to the general population, it does account for a significant 1 in 5 postpartum deaths, and is said to be the second leading cause of death for women in the postpartum period. Reducing the suicide risk in women after delivery is a public health priority. Recent studies have said 1 in 7 new moms struggles with postpartum depression. Only a small fraction of them will actually attempt suicide." All right, so we've talked about a lot of the data. Let's get into the real world here. Another group caught my attention. It might have caught yours too right away. Did you notice the youngest people being tracked for suicide are just 10 years old? Imagine that at 10 years old. It's horrible. How are counselors treating patients from the youngest, 10, to the oldest? And how can we help our friends and our family? I asked Jennifer Weaver, a licensed clinical social worker who treats young people. Jennifer, when we were preparing this story, the thing that hit me right away was that there's even a bracket that includes tracking suicides in 10-year-olds. It's astounding.
Yes, suicide at younger ages, 10 is unusual, certainly. And, we start to see increasing rates in the 14, 15 range. But it's certainly not unheard of. In fact, it's occasionally possible even in younger ages. And it is certainly a real problem within the adolescent community and young adult communities.
I've heard all these theories. These are deaths of despair. Are people feeling isolated? Are they feeling lonely? What are your patients saying to you?
Yes, so there's certainly an idea that suicide can feel like a solution to a problem, solution to pain, and also a solution to feeling lonely or as if life weren't living. There's a lot of, we hear a lot about the sort of why bother kinds of conversations. I'm not really sure. They don't feel that sense of purpose and generativity that I think a lot of us do. And there's definitely a tremendous connection between that and clinical depression, of course. There's not a complete overlap between the two.
What is the field of mental health doing right now to make sure that this does not keep going up?
Yes. Well, I think there's been a shift recently that I think is a positive thing, which is that we've shifted more from why, asking the question why, to how, and that is a much more practical approach. There's a bridge. There are 2 bridges in Rock Creek Park, the Ellington and the Taft. Yes, here in D.C., right over Rock Creek, and the Ellington had a significant number of suicides until about the mid-1980s, and the Taft had very few. They're right next to each other. They're practically identical bridges. They put up a wall to on the Ellington, even though people argued, why would we bother? People will go right next door to the Taft. Mm-hmm. But people didn't do that. And what was the difference between those 2 bridges? Weirdly, the main difference that people could come up with was the Taft's walls were about chest high, and the Ellington's walls were about waist high. There's something about the means for the impulsivity. Suicides dropped by almost half in Washington, D.C. once they put up that barrier to that one bridge.
Unbelievable. Aside from saying, like, hey, how are you doing, is there anything else that people could or should do?
Certainly people need to be asked directly, and the language needs to be used. Are you feeling suicidal? Has that crossed your mind? Have you thought about a plan? Do you have a way to kill yourself if you wanted to? Is a really great, weirdly direct, extremely uncomfortable question to ask. As the asker, that feels very uncomfortable. But that can be, yes, intrusive and also possibly giving an idea. But in fact, that probably is a really effective thing to do. And most people who feel suicidal really, within a short period of time, don't any longer. These people don't feel any hope. They don't see any way out. But if they can be in a physically safe if they can be physically safe during that time, then generally they move on.
We've heard so many numbers and stories tonight. I hope what you recall from this is globally, suicide's going down in most rich countries. The U.S. going up. The best thing you can always do if you're feeling this, reach out. If you suspect someone is in a bad situation or mindset, ask them directly, are you thinking about hurting yourself? Someone will always help.